do you remember the video that we had in church today? Like, where did the team go? And he goes, Guatemala. And I said, okay, so what you're telling me is if you're really poor and in Guatemala, we care about you enough to go down there and build you a house. But if you're even more desperate than those people and you want to walk all the way through Mexico in hopes that you can get here, we want to villainize you. Now, that doesn't mean we should just let all those people in. It just means we should be just as concerned about them as we are the people who stayed in Guatemala.
The Mission Matters podcast is a partnership between 1615 and Missio Nexus, who have a shared passion to mobilize the people of God to be a part of His mission.
Well, hi, welcome to the Mission Matters podcast. I'm your host, Ted Esler, and unfortunately, I'm solo today. Matthew's not able to join me, but we'll hopefully have a great conversation with the guest that I'm very pleased to have on. It's my predecessor at Missio Nexus, Steve Moore. Steve, welcome to the call.
Thank you, Ted.
Well, we're going to be talking about a hot topic right now. I wouldn't say just in the U.S. I'd say this is a global topic. Mm-hmm. We're going to be talking about immigration. And Steve, I believe you've published a book on this topic, have you not?
Well, indirectly. In 2010, I published a book called Who is My Neighbor? And that book dealt with the challenge of trying to figure out how do I apply the Good Samaritan principle in a digitally connected world? And that did include a conversation about immigration, but it wasn't the sole focus of the book.
Yeah. And Steve has been affiliated with World Relief for some time. Of course, they've been in the news a lot lately. And a few weeks ago, we did a podcast. We talked about immigration. And I think the overall gist of that was making the point that, countries can control their borders if they want, which is a fine point. But we're actually taking things in a different direction today. We're trying to give you some different perspectives on immigration. Steve, let's start with this one. What is the scope right now of the global immigration? And I'm going to use the word crisis to talk about it.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's pretty widely agreed that this is unprecedented in its scope. The latest UN numbers from 2024 would say that there are 122 million people who have been uprooted because of conflict, persecution, a variety of reasons. About 72 million of those would be considered internally displaced people. And then just over another 43 million of those would be classified as refugees. And then just under 7 million that would be considered asylum seekers. So there are a number of different drivers of this, conflict being a really big one. And of course, we've seen an uptick in that in a number of places around the world. And that's been a big driver of it.
Yeah. I think in the U.S., people tend to think of this as primarily an economic issue. Do you see it that way? Do you think that's correct?
It's a combination of factors, and certainly people who are really, really poor can be really, really desperate. But I think it would be incorrect to suggest that that's the only factor. It's definitely not. When you look at what's happening in Sudan right now, it's just a mess. And there are many internally displaced peoples there, a lot of new refugees that have gone over to Chad. Of course, the situation in Ukraine has been, a challenge for 3 years now. And those have nothing to do with, or almost nothing to do with poverty.
Yeah. I was in Cairo actually last summer. Now, Cairo, I don't know, was 12, 13, 14 million people, large city, right? And I believe the number that I kept hearing was about 4 million Sudanese refugees just in that one city. And I mean, it'd be like one out of every 4, 1 out of every 5 people is a displaced person.
Yeah.
In fact, let's talk about the definitions a little bit. When we talk about, you just mentioned a couple of different categories: displaced persons, refugees, and asylum seekers. Can you delineate for us what those categories are referring to?
Sure. Internally displaced persons are individuals who have fled their home because of conflict, persecution, whatever the driver is, but they haven't crossed an international border into another country. So they're internal to their home country, but they're displaced from their homes. Refugee is a legal term based on international law, and you can't declare yourself a refugee. So people who cross an international border are initially asylum seekers, and then their situation has to be adjudicated, typically by the UN High Commission on Refugees, to determine that they have a well-founded fear of persecution and can't return to their homeland. And there's 5 different, specific categories. It can't just be for random reasons. It has to do with your political beliefs, with your religion, with your country of origin, your social status, etc. So those would be the main differences between the 3.
Okay. Just as a side note, I'm curious, Steve, have you ever seen the movie Swim?
I haven't.
So it tells the story of a couple of refugees that came from Syria during the conflict into Greece. And it traces their whole journey through Turkey and into Greece. And I happen to work at the exact same refugee camp that's highlighted in that movie. And they show the reason why it's called Swim is because these girls were swimmers that actually one of them went on to swim in the Olympics. Really great movie. If you're interested in this topic
I'm familiar with this story, but I haven't seen the movie.
The movie's really, really worth watching if you haven't seen it.
And just to dive into the asylum side of it for just a moment.
Yeah.
Of course, in order to be categorized as a refugee, you have to cross an international border.
Sure.
But most of these asylum seekers, when they're crossing an international border, they're almost always breaking the law of the country that they're fleeing to. And then, their situation has to be adjudicated to determine that you really are legally classified as a refugee. And so it gets a little bit complicated to kind of sort out the legality of all of this. So, for example, if a North Korean Christian escapes into China and then is smuggled out of China into South Korea, they've illegally crossed 2 different borders. And of course, this is not, complete random hypothetical. This kind of thing has certainly happened. But almost no Jesus followers would say that that person, because they broke the law to flee, should be sent back to North Korea. And of course, the same kind of thing happens even at our southern border. In fact, I heard a story today from a national news outlet about a Iranian woman who converted to Christianity and for fear of her life fled Iran, actually made her way to Mexico, came across the border illegally, surrendered herself to Border Patrol, claimed asylum, and was in the process. Unfortunately, because of the changes in what's happening in our immigration situation right now, she was recently sent to Panama. And so now she's stuck in Panama. And so this just gets nuanced and it's complicated, and it's hard to really think about these things in black and white terms.
I'm curious, are you aware of statistics that show what percentage of these people are in fact Christians?
Well, World Relief did some work with Open Doors, and I believe that in the later years of the previous administration, when there were about 100,000 refugees being resettled in a year, just under 30,000 of them were Christians. And I believe many of them, a high percentage of them, came from the 50 countries that Open Doors classifies as being on their persecution list. So there are a lot of people who are coming to the U.S. who are Christians, many of them coming from Latin American countries, and they just happen to be Christians. But there are a number of them coming from the countries that Open Doors would consider on their top 50 watch list.
I exchanged some messages via X with somebody in the UK on the topic of immigration, and they pointed out that 2 out of every 3 immigrants into the UK are coming from a Christian background, which is it's surprising to us because we see images, of cities, like Bradford, which are completely Muslim.
Yeah.
So a high percentage of these are Christians. What is let's take your friend from Iran you talked about. What is the official process for a person to be approved as a refugee and resettled to the U.S.?
Well, typically a person would, cross an international border. The UN High Commission on Refugees would interview them, determine that they do have a well-grounded fear of returning, and classifies them as a refugee. Once that happens, the UN would then assign them or recommend them to a country to be resettled. So refugees can't pick what country they're going to be resettled to. They're recommended by the UN High Commission on Refugees. So if somebody is recommended to be resettled to the U.S., the U.S. is not required to take them. We have our own, each country has their own vetting process, and it's widely agreed that the vetting process for refugees for the U.S. is the most thorough of any category of person coming to our country. Homeland Security is involved. All the terror watch lists are involved. Health screening is involved. It's typically an 18-month to 24-month process. And ultimately, once the U.S. determines we believe this person is not going to pose a threat to our country, they will then assign that individual or that family to one of 10 refugee resettlement non-government organizations that the U.S. government has identified and contracted with to resettle them. So going all the way back to 1980, the U.S. government has determined the best way to actually resettle people is not for the government to do it once they've been thoroughly vetted, but to do it in a public-private partnership with resettlement organizations, and there are only 10 of them. There are several of those resettlement organizations that are Christian organizations. Only one of them would be in the evangelical category of Christianity, and that's World Relief. And so the resettlement organization would then be responsible to meet that family at the airport and have prepared for them to walk them through the process of starting their new life here. World Relief would try to do that whenever possible in partnership with a local church, and in particular with what they would call, World Relief would call, a good neighbor team that's formed in advance to help receive this family. And I've been privileged to be part of several of these good neighbor teams. And in fact, I'm walking with a refugee family that our team helped resettle just a little over 90 days ago from the Democratic Republic of Congo, who are here in our community. And it's just been a joy to watch them start their lives over. The refugees often spend an extended amount of time in a camp while they're waiting to be resettled. Only about 1% of all refugees get resettled from these camps.
Sure.
And the time in a camp can be 10 to 15 years. So the family that we just worked with, and they've been here for just a little more than 3 months. The husband in this family was in the camp for 13 years. He met his wife there. She was there for 25 years. She came when she was 18 months old, and they have 2 children who were born in the camp. And so they're beginning their lives here. They're Christians. And I had a delightful conversation with them after church on Sunday in the hallway while they were picking up their kids from Sunday school.
So what can you tell us about the current status of asylum and refugee resettlement in the U.S.?
Well, every administration has the opportunity to establish its own priorities. The number of refugees being resettled is totally in the hands of the president. And so the president can make that determination. This administration has put a pause on all refugee resettlement. They said the pause was going to be for 90 days while they evaluate the program. That's really not new. We kind of expected that. That's what happened in the first time that President Trump was elected. But what was not expected is that there was also a decision to not follow through on the payment that would be necessary to take care of these families for the first 90 days after they have arrived here. And so for World Relief, that means 4,000 refugees who had been resettled going back through December. And the government had vetted them, flown them here, assigned them to World Relief, but now is saying they're not going to provide the support. The support the government gives is not enough to take care of these families. World Relief raises additional funds to cover that difference. So that was not expected, and it's been really difficult for all the resettlement organizations. On top of that, there have been some changes to asylum, and so the CBP One app, Customs and Border Protection app that people would use, say in Mexico, to schedule an appointment to claim asylum at a legal port of entry. That app was shut down, and so it's currently not possible for someone to make an appointment to schedule a meeting with someone at a legal point of entry to claim asylum. And then in addition to that, something referred to as temporary protected status, which is conferred on people who are here, but the country they're from is experiencing unusual turmoil. The two countries in particular are Venezuela and Haiti. And so the temporary protected status has been lifted for both of those. I believe for Haiti, it ends August 3rd, and for Venezuela, it's actually April the 16th. And so it represents hundreds of thousands of people who are here under that temporary protected status who will be forced to be sent back to those countries. And then, of course, we also are aware of the fact that there's a significant effort to repatriate people who are here illegally. No one questions the fact that people who've committed crimes, particularly violent crimes, should be sent back to wherever they came from. But it's much broader than that, including the Iranian woman that I mentioned a little while ago, who had never committed any crime and had a very legitimate reason why she was here. She couldn't be sent back to Iran because we don't have diplomatic relations with them. So she was sent to Panama instead, along with a number of other people.
So I would expect by this time, in this interview, some of our listeners are thinking that the extreme amount of illegal immigration, and I think extreme is probably a reasonable word, as well as illegal drugs coming across the southern border, justify some drastic measures to be taken, these extraordinary measures. What's your response to that?
Yeah, as it relates to the drug situation, the conversation is mostly around fentanyl, and that's a horrible problem. We know the crisis that has created. Customs and Border Protection, their own data would say that 90% of fentanyl that's brought across the southern border is brought by either U.S. citizens or legal residents in the U.S. And 90% of it is brought across in trucks at legal ports of entry. So essentially, drug traffickers, they hide this fentanyl in a semi loaded with a whole bunch of stuff, and they bring it across at a border. It's way more efficient for them to do it that way, even if some of it gets caught, than it is to try to smuggle it across at some, desert sneak across the border kind of a situation. In terms of the immigration challenge itself, we desperately need comprehensive immigration reform. And most Christians, based on a Lifeway survey, even in 2025, would say that they would like to see our, congressional leaders step up and provide significant reform to our immigration process. And that's clearly needed.
Well, Steve, having, written on this topic, or as you said, it adjacent topic, what's your view? What does the Bible have to say about how we relate to foreigners among us?
Yeah, I think everyone realizes that, even in the Old Testament, the Leviticus 19 passages that talk to the people of Israel about how to treat foreigners among them and reminding them that you were a foreigner in Egypt, and, God's commands there, the story of the Good Samaritan, lays out pretty clearly how we're to treat people, even if they're different from us. There's been some conversation around kind of prioritizing our responsibility to other people, and there clearly are some biblical rationales for that. But, Jesus also said, if you only love people who love you, what credit are you going to get for that? And so clearly the attitude we have toward people who are suffering and are fleeing persecution or even economic challenges should be, I think, reflecting the heart of Jesus, who, when he saw people were hurting, he was moved with compassion. I think we can be moved with compassion and want to treat people with dignity inherent based on their being created in the image of God, without believing that we could or should welcome everyone who wants to come to our country. I had a really interesting experience in the parking lot of the church that I attend a number of years ago, during the time when there were these, quote, caravans of migrants coming up through Mexico heading for the border. And on that particular Sunday morning, we had a short video clip of a short-term mission team from the church, a youth group team that had gone to Guatemala to build houses for poor people there. And, they showed this little video, everyone clapped. It was a big, kind of a celebration kind of moment. And then in the parking lot after church, someone from my small group came up to me and asked me, what do you think about all these caravans of people coming up, through Mexico? And I said, where do you think they're from? And he said, oh, they're from Central America, they're from Guatemala, whatever. And I said, well, do you remember the video that we had in church today? Like, where did the team go? And he goes, Guatemala. And I said, okay, so what you're telling me is if you're really poor and in Guatemala, we care about you enough to go down there and build you a house. But if you're even more desperate than those people and you want to walk all the way through Mexico in hopes that you can get here, we want to villainize you. Now, that doesn't mean we should just let all those people in. It just means we should be just as concerned about them as we are the people who stayed in Guatemala. And I think that's really what I long to see the church embrace, as a recognition that we long to display the heart of Jesus for people who are in these desperate conditions, even while we sort out the complex, nuanced policy discussions that we have to have.
Let's camp on that policy question just a little bit. What do you think, from a biblical perspective, we might think about in terms of refugee policy?
Yeah, World Relief, along with the National Association of Evangelicals, for years, going back more than a decade, has been advocating for simple reforms that would say, first, make it harder for people to immigrate illegally. And a big part of that is related to securing the border. Secondly, make it easier for people to immigrate legally by adapting our visa system to be more responsive to the U.S. labor market, for families who are seeking to be reunified with people from their family who are still in another country. And then third, to create some kind of earned legalization process for immigrants who are in the U.S. already. That would involve paying some kind of a fine of restitution and meet other common sense qualifications, in order to stay here. Of course, if a person's here who's committed a violent crime or is suspected of being a threat, then they wouldn't meet any of these criteria and should be, returned to their country of origin. I think those are things that Christians generally could agree to.
One of the criticisms that I've heard about World Relief is that they've taken government money and therefore they really can't speak on these things in a way that's reasonably objective because they're funded by the government. So therefore they favor government solutions. What's your reaction to that kind of a charge?
Well, first of all, in order to be involved in refugee resettlement in terms of actually being responsible to receive people at the airport and help them get situated here, you have to be one of the 10 organizations the government has contracted with. No other group can do it. And so that's the first thing, is it's a public-private partnership. In terms of the money that the government gives, it's not enough to take care of the people who come. All of these resettlement organizations rely on additional donations. World Relief relies on the goodwill and generosity of Christians and churches to help with this. And so, we've been involved in multiple Good Neighbor teams in helping to resettle families. Our church small group rallied together to kind of help furnish an apartment and get it ready for a family. Our church ultimately, with one family, sponsored a Habitat for Humanity home that this family actually got, and our small group was able to help them build the house that they now live in. So I don't see why this is such a controversial thing. For years, Christians actively lobbied the government to say we should be treated fairly with regard to government money, and that we should not be discriminated against just because we're Christians. And we've actually made really good strides in that arena. And that's why I find it odd to think that we would feel like there's something wrong with a Christian organization receiving money from the government in order to participate in this. World Relief has said, we would like to see every refugee family resettled by World Relief surrounded by a group of 10 to 12 Jesus followers from a local church who participate in helping that family, regardless of where they come from or what they believe, to be welcomed into our country and loved by a Christian, group of Christians who help them start their new life here. And I've been able to do that in a couple of different families and active in one right now, and it's an amazing opportunity.
Yeah. Let's close with this question here. Zooming out to 10,000 feet, what's the opportunity for the Global Great Commission in this area of immigration and refugee work?
It's long been understood that the worldview of a person is most open to change when certain things happen in their life. And one of those is when they're totally disrupted and they have to leave their home country and go somewhere else. That is a unique window of opportunity where people will begin to reflect on what they believe, including what they believe in terms of their faith, in a way that maybe they never otherwise would. And so it creates an amazing opportunity for Christians to love those people in that vulnerable moment unconditionally, serve them with no strings attached, but then be in a position to explain the reason why I'm doing this is because I'm trying my best to follow the commands and the teachings of Jesus. And that kind of conversation is completely appropriate. World Relief is not limited. We can't withhold services to people based on, what faith they have. That's ridiculous. But there's no requirement to hide the motivations for why you're doing it. And it's an amazing opportunity. And there are so many countries around the world where it's very difficult, dangerous, in some cases, not very practical for American Christians to go and live there long term. But some of those very same countries are among those who are being disrupted, and some of those individuals are coming here. And I pray that we don't miss the opportunity to love them.
Amen. Well, our guest today was Steve Moore. Steve, thank you so much. That was a pretty interesting discussion, and I think it'll bless a lot of people.
Thank you, Ted. My pleasure.
Before you go, be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. The Mission Matters podcast is a partnership of 1615 and Missio Nexus. Check out 1615.org and missionexus.org for more resources on the mission of God and the matters of the mission. The Mission Matters podcast is hosted by Matthew Ellison, president of 1615, and Ted Esler, president of Missio Nexus.